The Skywarrior was engineered from its very first blueprint for one job only: delivering the heaviest nuclear bomb the Navy could build to an enemy capital, then spent nearly 40 years in service doing almost everything except that. While the weight-saving decision to strip out ejection seats, made to win the contract in the first place, waited 3 decades to collect its price. Landing on a carrier at night is hard enough in a nimble fighter. On January 25, 1987, Lieutenant Alan A. Levine was trying to bring something far bigger down onto the deck of USS Nimitz. 76 feet of steel, a swollen bomb bay slung beneath high-mounted wings, an aircraft built from its very first blueprint for one purpose only: long-range nuclear war. It was, by any modern standard, an aberration, and Levine was fighting control systems older than he was. In an A-7 Corsair or an F-14 Tomcat, a pilot would hit the deck and stop almost instantly. This aircraft would not settle. 5 approaches had already failed. The fuel was running out, too low now to reach land, and sailors were stretching an emergency steel net across the deck. A last resort meant to catch aircraft that could not stop themselves. It had already claimed lives before his, and Levine had no ejection seat to fall back on. How does a machine engineered to end the world with a nuclear bomb end up, 4 decades later? Betting 7 lives on a steel net and a prayer, having never once dropped the weapon it was actually built to carry. The answer starts on a drafting table at the Douglas Aircraft Company, years before Levine was born, where chief designer Ed Heinemann stared at a set of Navy specifications that seemed to defy solving. The Navy wanted a brand new long-range attack aircraft, one able to carry bombs as heavy as 10,000 pounds deep into enemy territory. On its face, that wasn't an outrageous ask. During World War II, American bombers had already hauled payloads up to 20,000 pounds into the sky. But 3 years after the last bombs fell over Europe, few aerospace firms wanted any part of what the Navy was proposing this time, because buried in the requirements was a second demand that made everything harder. The aircraft had to launch from a carrier deck. No one had ever built anything like it. The post-war jet boom made a bigger carrier aircraft more plausible in theory, but most engineers still considered the whole idea borderline absurd. Competitor after competitor read the specifications and walked away. Heinemann kept sketching. The only other company willing to stay in the fight was Curtiss-Wright, a firm that had already proven itself with the P-40 Warhawk, a fighter bomber that had reportedly turned 200 pilots into aces and become the 3rd most produced American fighter of the war. If anyone was going to beat Heinemann to the punch, it was them, and they moved fast, unveiling a design that met every Navy requirement while staying under the non-negotiable 100,000 weight ceiling. For a company with that kind of wartime pedigree to move first should, by any normal logic, have settled the contract on the spot. Still, Heinemann believed he could do better. If Curtiss-Wright could go low, he decided, Douglas would go lower. That meant thinking several moves ahead of the Navy itself. The service was planning to base its new bomber on the coming United States-class supercarriers, colossal ships stretching nearly 100 feet and carrying up to 72 aircraft, decks that would have swallowed a 100,000-pound aircraft without complaint. But Heinemann suspected the Air Force would never let a ship like that reach the water. The 2 branches were locked in an open turf war, each one working to strangle the other's budget-hungry programs. So Heinemann bet instead that the real aircraft would have to fly off, the smaller midway-class carriers. And that meant cutting the Navy's own specifications down even further than requested. Douglas engineers stripped out standard instrumentation, removed ejection seats entirely, and slipped the design just under the dimensional limits the Navy had set, gambling that advancing weapons technology would soon shrink warheads enough to make the original size requirements obsolete. It was a quiet bet that would not come due for more than 3 decades, but it was already being placed. And it was a bet that could easily have ended Heinemann's career. Instead, Douglas delivered a design at just 68,000 pounds. However, Navy officials studied it and were openly skeptical that any aircraft that light could still deliver the attack capability they needed. Even so, they no longer had the luxury of being picky. Heineman's read on the Air Force turned out to be exactly right. The United States-class program was canceled just 5 days after the first ship's keel was laid. With no big-deck carrier coming and no time left to waste, the Navy had to gamble on the only team still bold enough to have designed for the smaller ships all along. Winning the contract, though, was only the beginning of Heineman's troubles. The Navy required Douglas to build around Westinghouse's J-40 turbojet, an engine advertised on paper as one of the most powerful afterburning turbojets of its era. In practice, the first tests told a different story. The first thing we learned, Heineman later admitted, was that the J-40 was not powerful enough. Worse, Douglas was contractually stuck buying more Westinghouse hardware alongside it, including the radar, the tail turret, and the electrical generators, components of wildly uneven quality. To guarantee the aircraft could get off a carrier deck, even if its underpowered engines faltered, engineers bolted a dozen J-TOW rocket bottles onto the tail for emergency thrust. And the airframe itself did nothing to inspire confidence. The oversized bomb bay forced a bulging belly that pushed the swept wings up unnaturally high on the fuselage, a silhouette so strange that Navy personnel simply started calling it the whale. Getting a shape like that into the air didn't look difficult. It looked like an argument with physics itself. When one of the early prototypes finally rolled out for its maiden flight in late 1952, several of its own designers reportedly couldn't bring themselves to watch, certain it would crash the moment it left the ground. Instead, as test pilot George Jansen throttled up, the whale rolled forward, lifted off with unexpected elegance, and held altitude with a stability nobody in the program had predicted. There was still plenty to fix, an underpowered engine chief among it, and an entire generation of Navy crews still had to learn how to land something this size on a moving deck. But one fact was now undeniable. With a payload capacity of up to 12,000 pounds, the Navy finally had more than an attack bomber. It had a genuine nuclear strike platform, one that could reshape the balance of power at sea. Officially christened the Douglas A-3 Skywarrior, the aircraft began reaching fleet squadrons in 1956, and every sailor aboard those carriers understood a new era of deterrence had arrived. Until then, most American atomic weapons had been stuck on ground bases or short-legged carrier aircraft like the A.J. Savage, forcing commanders to choose between power and reach. Once the underpowered J-40 was finally swapped for the Pratt and Whitney J-57, one of the first American jet engines capable of delivering up to 10,000 pounds of thrust, that trade-off disappeared for good. With these sea-based giants at the fleet's disposal, no point on the planet was truly out of reach anymore, not even for the heaviest nuclear payload in the American arsenal. The Whale could cover as much as 300 miles without refueling, hit speeds over 600 miles an hour despite its size, 76 feet long with a 72-foot wingspan, and cruise at high altitude with a stability that made it ideal for exactly the kind of mission it had been designed for. Crews could walk back from the cockpit into the internal bay mid-flight to assemble and arm a nuclear weapon, the only method available at the time to ready one for use. Automatic slats eased its approach back to the deck, and its wings and tail folded neatly to fit the elevators and hangars below. By every measure, the Skywarrior looked like the most promising nuclear deterrent in the entire Navy arsenal. And then, just as it was settling into that role, something else arrived to take it away. In the late 1950s, a new kind of predator entered the water, ballistic missile submarines like USS George Washington, vessels that could vanish beneath the ocean for as long as their crews could endure and unleash a strike far deadlier than anything the Whale could physically carry. Against that, the A-3 had no answer. Yet the engineers who had already bent the laws of physics once were not about to let their aircraft's career end on that note. and it turned out the Skywarrior was too capable to simply retire. By the early 1960s, the Navy had effectively ruled the Whale out as a strategic nuclear bomber. But instead of disappearing, it began reinventing itself into something that no longer needed to drop a payload on an enemy capital to matter. The first modified variants swapped bombs for camera packs inside the weapons bay. A photograph could not destroy a target, but during the Cold War, images of rival troop movements and hidden weapons programs were sometimes worth more than a dozen bombing runs. From there, the transformation only accelerated. The K-3B version became a flying gas station, hauling more than 34,000 pounds of fuel and handing it off to Allied aircraft running dangerously low over hostile territory. The EK-A-3B went further still, stripping the rear turret for a streamlined tail fairing while keeping the refueling gear, so it could jam enemy radar and refuel friendly aircraft in the same pass, one of the most capable dual-role workhorses the Navy had ever fielded. So when tensions in the Gulf of Tonkin boiled over and communist forces pushed across Southeast Asia, the Navy already knew exactly what to send: the A-3 Skywarrior, headed for Vietnam. American crews arriving in theater had little idea what awaited them. The terrain was savage and unforgiving. Dense jungle canopy, hidden dirt roads carved through the trees, steep hills no ground vehicle could climb, and whole stretches of Vietnam and its neighboring countries, where communist forces bled across borders, so unmapped that no American chart even showed them, leaving soldiers pushing forward effectively blind. This was where the Whale, in its new form, earned its keep. Fitted with a dozen high-definition camera stations, RY-3B reconnaissance variants from Heavy Photographic Squadrons 61 and 62, scoured the countryside day and night, mapping roads, trails, and Viet Cong buildups the old charts had never shown. Once a target was confirmed, formations of EK-A-3Bs followed the strike aircraft in, jamming enemy radar and screening the approach. And when a fighter ran low on fuel mid-mission, the same Whales were there to refuel it, even while running low themselves. On May 31, 1967, that improvisation reached its limit and then exceeded it. A Skywarrior was still mid-refuel from a KC-135 tanker when word came that an F-8 Crusader was inbound, critically low on fuel, and the tanker's systems were incompatible with the fighters. So, with no manual for the situation, the Skywarrior simply ordered the Crusader to slide in underneath it, deployed its drogue, and completed the first triple-level aerial refueling in history, saving the fighter from almost certain loss. By the end of the war, the Whale was credited with saving as many as 71 aircraft this way. The aircraft engineered from its very first blueprint to deliver one nuclear weapon to an enemy capital had, over Vietnam, become most valuable in the moments it wasn't dropping anything at all. Still, Vietnam was not finished asking things of it. Almost as soon as the first A-3s arrived, the Navy ordered crews back into the bombing role, this time with naval mines and roughly 2,000-pound Mark 84 free-fall bombs, nothing close to the 12.0-pound nuclear payloads the design had once been built around, and lacking any guidance system at all. Even without a bomb sight built for precision work, crews dove toward their targets anyway, skimming the treetops lower than the aircraft was ever meant to fly, dropping ordnance into enemy positions before clawing back into the sky through the smoke. A strategic bomber with no dive bombing pedigree whatsoever was, somehow, playing dive bomber. It worked often enough to keep happening, but not everyone was comfortable with how. General William Westmoreland, commanding U.S. forces in the country, warned that without a proper bomb sight, A-3 crews were effectively bombing on instinct, and instinct that occasionally succeeded was still instinct that could just as easily hit the wrong target. For the rest of the war, Skywarrior bombing runs were restricted to radar-guided strikes only, a demotion that stung for crews who had just found their nerve for diving into the fight. But by then, the Skywarrior had already stacked up so many different jobs: reconnaissance, tanking, jamming, mining, and now bombing, that one more adjustment to its mission profile, barely registered as unusual anymore. Or at least, that was what commanders assumed going in. The clearest example of how much the Navy was still willing to ask of the whale came in mid-1967, when Skywarriors were tasked with mining the narrow channel into Haiphong Harbor, one of North Vietnam's most vital supply routes. The stakes were enormous: one drifting mine, one accidental strike on a foreign ship, and the war could escalate into territory Washington desperately wanted to avoid. Success, on the other hand, might force the enemy to the negotiating table after 12 years of fighting. 4 Skywarriors, each carrying 10 1,000-pound Mark 52 magnetic mines, launched under cover of darkness, flying just 50 feet above the water to avoid detection. At first, everything held. The lead aircraft reported steady progress with no sign of the enemy. Then, as the remaining 2 whales lined up to launch, contact with one of the aircraft, already airborne, simply vanished. No radar spike, no distress call, no wreckage anyone could find then or in the decades since. Commanders, unwilling to risk more crews against an unknown threat in the dark, scrubbed the rest of the mission and recalled everyone still in the air. It would be 5 years before another strike package finally slipped into those waters and laid enough mines to blockade the harbor for good. And by then the job went to a squadron of A-7E Corsairs. The whale's attack days in Vietnam were already over, and credit for the mission it had first been sent to finish belonged to someone else. Yet Vietnam alone never came close to using up the Skywarrior. Even pulled from the front lines, it had proven itself one of the most capable and versatile aircraft in the entire Navy inventory, and it kept earning its keep well into the Cold War's final act. By the 1980s, nearly a quarter century after it first reached the fleet, crews were still strapping into Skywarrior cockpits, flying reconnaissance over the Middle East as tensions rose between American allies and Soviet-backed regimes. The variant of choice by then was the EA-3B, carrying a crew of 7 and a suite of tracking computers built to locate, analyze, and jam enemy signals without effort. On a typical sortie, the pilots simply held the aircraft steady and on course for hours, while the team crammed into the rear compartment monitored what crews called the black box, scanning non-stop for electronic emissions, radar pulses, and signal patterns that might reveal what the Soviets were up to. Missions that often stretched from takeoff clear through to sundown. And in a final irony, those crews were finally flying the whale off the very supercarriers Heinemann had once bet the Navy would never build. Ships like the Nimitz-class USS Carl Vinson, stretching nearly 100 feet and launching aircraft off C-13 steam catapults in under 5 seconds at more than 150 knots. No JATO bottles required. Even so, the aircraft's oldest limitation had never gone away. It still could not take off with a full fuel load. So every mission began the same way: clear the deck, then head straight to a tanker before the real work could start. Hours later, the same aircraft would return, slamming from 143 miles an hour to a dead stop in under 3 seconds as the arresting cable caught the tailhook, a maneuver that never stopped looking more dangerous than it was supposed to be. Eventually, though, the physics the whale had spent decades outrunning caught up with it. By the late 1980s, an estimated 42% of the 200 E-3 Skywarriors ever built had been severely damaged or destroyed in accidents or combat. One of the worst came on that January night in 1987 aboard USS Nimitz. Lieutenant Alan Levine's EA-3B, returning from a routine surveillance flight with a crew of 7, proved notoriously unstable at low speed, and on this approach it refused to cooperate. Levine circled again and again, hunting for the position that would let the arresting wires catch the aircraft, and each time the whale slipped away from him at the last second. Fuel kept falling, with no tanker left to save them and no ejection seats to bail out with. The crew's only real option was to trust the emergency barricade rigged across the deck. It should have worked. But the barricade had been rigged incorrectly, its upper strap left dangerously loose, and when the Skywarrior's nose gear struck the top band, it punched straight through. The aircraft sailed off the angled deck and into the dark sea below. Rescue helicopters reached the crash site within seconds. It made no difference. The whale's hull sank quickly, and it took all 7 men down with it. The decision to strip out ejection seats for weight, made more than 3 decades earlier on Heinemann's drafting table, finally collecting its price. There would not be much time left to make up for it. At over 30 years old, the A-3 was already nearing the end of its service life, and it flew its last active deployment in 1991, when a handful of veteran whales joined the first Gulf War in the skies over Iraq. It was no longer the fastest or most feared aircraft in the fleet, but its electronic jamming systems still worked well enough to help shield a newer generation of fighters as they went in. It was not a dramatic final chapter, but it was a fitting one for an aircraft that had spent almost 40 years proving people wrong. Today, fewer than 24 Skywarriors are believed to survive, scattered across museums, military bases and airfields in the United States, a handful under slow restoration, not to fly again, but simply so the whale is not forgotten. Consider, in the end, what Ed Heinemann actually built. A bomber designed for one job only, delivering the heaviest nuclear weapon America could build to an enemy capital, and an aircraft that across nearly 40 years of service would do almost everything except that. Submarines took its intended mission away before it ever fired a shot in anger. The whale answered by becoming a spy plane, a flying gas station, a radar jammer, and, when nobody expected it, a low-level dive bomber skimming the treetops of a jungle it was never built to see. It cheated the rules of physics on its very first flight, and kept cheating them for 3 decades after, hauling fuel to stranded fighters, mapping enemy territory no map had ever shown, and hunting Soviet signals from the decks of the very supercarriers it was once told it would never fly from. Right up until a poorly rigged strap and a cost-cutting decision made in 1949 finally caught up with 7 men who never got the chance to reach for an ejection handle that had never been there at all. The aircraft nobody thought could leave the ground kept finding new ways to prove exactly how wrong that was.